Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck. This is the novel that I will discuss today. Jenny Erpenbeck is a German language writer. She was born in the Republic Democratic of Germany, in Communist Germany, in 1957. And she's not only a writer, she is also an opera director. And this is visible also in the way she writes. This novel was awarded the International Booker Prize 2024. It is, I think, the second time in a row that an Eastern European receives this prize. Last year it was the Bulgarian Georgi Gospodinov for Time Shelter. So I first encountered Jenny Erpenbeck's name many years ago. It was in the early 2000s, I think, when I read the novella The Old Child, translated into English by Susan Bernofsky. This was translated, by which I mean Kairos by Erpenbeck, was translated by Michael Hoffman. Both of them very good translators from German into English, very experienced. And obviously, Kairos was awarded the most prestigious literary prize aside from the Nobel. All the people who wrote reviews about Kairos underline the fact that it's a rather gloomy novel. It is a story of passion, which I have to say that these days you rarely read stories of passion written by contemporary authors. So that was unusual. It was even more unusual when I listened to an interview with her, and she said that initially the novel was not conceived as a love story. She wanted to write more a sort of she wanted to do a description of life in, I think, communist Germany, from what I understood. And that's very striking that was the initial intention, because this is very much a love story. And it is true that communist Germany is the historical background, in particularly the last years of communism. And that's an interesting background, obviously, because it includes also the fall of the Berlin War, and it is based on quite intense research, not to mention the experience itself of the author. But as a love story is actually very strong. And it was even more surprising to hear the author's framework of the story in the interviews that I listened to, in which she talks about this novel. But first, let me just give you a little bit of a description of the structure. It's divided into two parts, box 1 and box 2. It starts with a prologue and ends with an epilogue, and the two boxes are separated by half a page called an intermezzo. And in the prologue, the narrator, called Katarina, receives two cardboard boxes that include the archives and the notebooks of her former lover, Hans. So the love story takes place in the 80s, and it's a story between a 19-year-old woman called Katarina and a man who is 34 years her senior, called Hans. And they met accidentally on a bus. The man is obviously married, he has a child, so this is an affair. And it's a very passionate love affair, which is described in the first part. And then in the second part, we witness the degradation of the story, which is caused by the betrayal of one of the protagonists, more specifically the woman. So she commits a betrayal, and then in the second part, the man punishes her constantly by constantly reminding her of the betrayal and by admonishing her and subjecting her to scenes of sadomasochism. It's a very tormented, obviously, love story, and that's what I loved about it, because it was written in a very raw, not just unsentimental style, but in a way that seemed to be unsparing, because the narrator is a woman. And what's what makes this novel really good is the fact that it's so well done that I was almost certain that it was an autobiographical story. It doesn't seem to be the case from what I heard in the interviews, which makes it even better. And also, what made it really good for me was that the novel was written from both perspectives, the men's and the woman's. Usually you have a sentence that describes the feelings of the woman, then the next sentence would describe the feelings of the man. And they are both very, very convincing. And that's what made me very attracted to it, and I enjoy it so much. But then I have to say that in the interviews that the author gave, I found that the interviews, contrary to what an interview might do, they impoverish the novel rather than enrich it. And I think that's a problem with the fact that we in our world have too much access to the authors of the books, of the fictions that we read. Because in order for a fiction to be great, it really needs a degree of mystery. You know, a work of fiction asks more questions than gives answers. And the mystery and the ambiguity, it's part of its power. And this work was powerful because it was a little mysterious. You couldn't really tell on which side the author was on. It was very well done. But then in the interviews, the author told us on which side she was on. And that took away from the mystery and took away from the power of the novel, because she ended up framing, by which I mean the author in interviews, she ended up framing the novel at the suggestion of the interlocutors, I have to say, as a story of abuse of a woman by a man. So in the end, because once you frame it in this way, it's not even necessary to write the story anymore. You just know it. You say, okay, this woman was abused by a man, and that's it. There's no more mystery. There's nothing more to discuss. It's almost like the story of an activist, which this novel is not. It's, again, as I'm saying, it's a very powerful novel. So it's just a word of caution to authors out there and to writers that interviews don't necessarily do your work of fiction. They don't necessarily do them any good, or they can actually impoverish them. This being said, obviously I recommend the novel. I think it deserves to be read. It's powerful. In terms of language, it's well written. I think Michael Hoffman, the translator, describes it in an interview as a novel written with many fragments of sentences, and it has an oral style and an immediate style. Because of that, I think, if I remember correctly, it's written in the present, I think, which gives it an immediacy. But I also have to say, although Michael Hoffman is a good translator and is an experienced translator, the translator has some problems, and I think that's mostly because of the fact that the translation was rushed. The original German appeared in 1921. The translation into English was done by Granta, published in 1923. So the translator had 1 year, I think, at most, to do this work, and it's 300 pages, a very thick, very substantial. It's a substantial novel in the sense that it has many words on the page. So the translation was a little bit rushed, and there are certain sentences that sound a little bit awkward. I don't know, Julie. I'm going to give just one example. No fault of Haydn's. It's durable, like all really good music, he says. Well, it's timeless, I would say. But let me also give you an example of a good sentence, because obviously there are many good sentences. No, she is clasping her two hands around Hans's face and pressing right up against him, so that he and she, with mouths and noses and closed eyes, are all alone together in a room made of skin. A room made of skin. That's a good sentence. Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck, a novel of a love story, a gloomed love story on the background of the last years of communist Germany.